All right. Um, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today. I'd like to thank the host for organizing this, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us here at Beechwood to share not only our Reconciling History program, but the decade-long journey that it took us to bring this program to fruition and really be seen not only as a truth teller, but also a company that actually lives reconciliation. I'll first start by presenting me, and I'm Nick McCarthy. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications and Community Outreach at Beechwood Cemetery. I've been here since 2017. I have the honor to work in a medium that really focuses on storytelling, raising public awareness, and elevating the cemetery status as the National Cemetery of Canada and a place of national memorial. I've also made it my mission to ensure that Beechwood is not only just a place of remembrance, but a place of living history, a place to celebrate life, a place to also hold ceremonial remembrance ceremonies. I'm also heavily involved in the Reconciling History program, and I play a key role in developing that program and the adaptation of it. For instance, in the next in the month of September to the beginning weeks of October, we're having almost 2,000 students come through the property to take the very same tour that you guys are doing. Of course, a little more in depth with an older audience. I'm also I work with to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into events, and under my leadership, we've really made strides to honor and Indigenous veterans and integrating Indigenous sacred symbols into traditional activities, as well as on headstones for the first time in 500 years, which we'll go into a little in depth later on. So the picture here, actually, it's just on last Friday, I was awarded the King Charles III Coronation Medal, picked as one of the 100 from the Governor General's personal allotment. And this was in recognition to my reconciliation work that I've been able to undertake, and specifically my reconciliation work within the military. So you can see very ecstatic about receiving that from Her Excellency just a few days ago, with an outstanding group of leaders from all across the country. So, why Beechwood? Why reconciliation? How does this story really start? So, we've been lucky enough to start reconciliation in 2014, and the idea behind it was came very organically. And so we look to partner with leaders in the community, as well leaders in different aspects of residential schools and Indigenous societies. So we've really been able to sort of move forward. Beechwood has always been a place of forward thinking. So the main objectives, before I get into a little more of the history, the main objectives of our programming is to provide a balanced history, highlight the achievements and the shortcomings of many of the prominent Canadians buried at Beechwood, which you can understand that can be very problematic for some. And I'll go into depth a little more about that as well. And also, most importantly, is fostering an understanding between the Indigenous and non Indigenous peoples of our country. So, this is by providing free tours, by encouraging people to come to the cemetery and take part in our reconciling history based activities. So, how does this program start? Why is there an idea to do this at a cemetery? And how does a cemetery in the middle of Ottawa, of all places, really come up with this program? So, in the 1990s, Beechwood started a Great Canadian Plaque program. There's these green plaques all across the property, and they really look at telling the stories of the individuals buried within our cemetery. So Duncan Campbell Scott was one of the first people that was taken notice within right before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission finished their report. So Dr. Cindy Blackstock came to Beechwood to find Duncan Campbell Scott's grave, and we'll go into details why that becomes an important moment and an important grave within this context. But so she comes, she sees the grave, and she learns about our plaque program. She reads the plaque, and it was very much written in a traditional colonial mindset. This was written in the early 1990s by very politely put, seasoned historians that looked at the old way of writing history, right? Very much Eurocentric, Canadian focused, very colonial mindset. So she became prepared to have an argument and really start pretty much coming to argue her position. So she came back the next day. She brought in people from Duncan Campbell Scott's faith community as well, because Duncan Campbell Scott does not have any descendants. And she approaches my president at the time. And my president, she was ready to sort of have that argument to prove her point. And my president at the time turned to her and said that we can take it down, but we're going to work together to really build something new. And of course, this was completely disarming. And if you listen to any interviews with Cindy Blackstock about um, this process, she was completely disarmed. And so he promised that he would take it down. And she didn't believe him at the time. So the next day she came back to Beechwood and the plaque had already been removed. And thus starts our road on reconciliation. We look at sort of transforming these plaques into a dual reflection, informing not only the readers of these achievements, but also the impact, both negative and positive, that these individuals may have had on the Indigenous community. Again, we're talking about people's final resting places, so there has to be a monarchy of respect at all times. We have to provide a dignified burial space, but we can also be true and talk about the history. We're not looking to rewrite history like we've been accused of or have people have shown us, but we're looking at providing a double-sided, providing the full, wholesome history, if you will. And these plaques have really, really reflected that. So our reconciling history starts with Duncan Campbell Scott, Canadian civil servant, poet, and prose writer. We know that he was the deputy superintendent of the Department of the then Indian Affairs. He supported the government's assimilation policy, mandating Indigenous children to attend residential schools, and he was instrumental in amending the Indian Act to make school attendance compulsory for Indigenous children. And he's really remembered for these policies that led to cultural genocide of Indigenous people, as noted based on the TRC. So when we're talking, as I mentioned prior to the start of this webinar, I just had about 150 students come through the property, and so we present Duncan Campbell Scott in this dualistic way as a silver sonnet poet, but we also talk about the simple fact that he was very much instrumental in laying the groundwork for the worst part of the residential schools, looking at how to remove dollars from the programming, looking at really systematically eradicating the Indigenous community. We know from his own writings, his own speech, that Duncan Campbell Scott was a nationalist, was a racist, and that he was an extremist even by his day. We know that he looked to eradicate the Indigenous population from Canada. And there's no way around saying it. Even when he would receive reports from our next figure, which is Dr. Henderson Bryce, he would deny them. He would write in the margins that Henderson Bryce wasn't telling the truth, or he would often just say the status of the Indigenous. Of course, not using that word, but the status of the Indigenous peoples in Canada were fine or good, knowing that children are dying in residential schools and Indigenous peoples on reserve were also being underfunded, malnourished, lack of basic needs at all times. So again, a lot of people confront Duncan Campbell Scott in a very meaningful way. We've had a lot of meaningful moments where residential school survivors have stood above his grave and taken a moment to tell Mr. Scott himself that they are still there, that their children are with them, and that the future is ready for them. And it's quite a moving moment. So as we're developing this program, we're also looking at people who are the voices, almost the champions of Indigenous peoples across Canada, and we were looking for somebody contemporary. And a lot of times, you get confronted when you're talking about residential schools. You get confronted with the fact that a lot of people say, "Well, that's the way everyone thought back then," which is a really hard reality for anybody to think. So what we were able to do is we were able to find proof that all people did not think this way. And Peter Henderson Bryce was a forgotten figure in Canadian history. So he was the first secretary of the Provincial Health Board. He was appointed chief medical officer for the Department of Immigration. He worked for the Department of the Interior. And he really was the first person to sound the alarm on the health conditions within Canada's residential school. And every report from 1907 to 1922 was suppressed. He was forced into retirement in 1921. What's interesting is for a man who wrote a report every year, the National Archives here in Ottawa only had his obituary on record, which is quite frightening if you think about it. So they really did do a lot to suppress it. We do know that we were able to see the story of the national crime. And this is a document that after he was fired from the public service, he was able to produce. We recently found out, however, that they found a technicality. He was working for two different departments when the departments split, and he was getting paid by each side. And that's the technicality they found to fire him at the time, which, if you think about it, it's quite a very low moment in Canadian history. So this gentleman publishes the story of the national crime in 1922. He self-funds it, and he talks about how healthy Indigenous children were put with kids who were sick, how kids were being sent home, how there was a lack of basic hygiene, a lack of food, a lack of healthy food, a lack of outdoor air, a lack of potable water, that there was rampant abuse. So again, it's this incredible idea that this gentleman here um, was the first speaker, the first person who spoke out. And we know for a fact that he and Duncan Campbell Scott went to the same church. They most likely went to the same mass because these were all affluent people in the Ottawa community. So we know they would have known each other. And you have one gentleman who's less educated than Peter Henderson Bryce, being a doctor, denying what what Dr. Bryce is noticing. So what Peter Henderson Bryce's grave has really become is a site of pilgrimage. And we were lucky enough to get some video of it. Here we go. We'll move it a little ahead. And so this is Peter Henderson Bryce's grave, and it's a well-kept grave, but a few years ago, about 2010, his grave was all but forgotten at Beechwood. And now it has a beautiful garden. It's got rocks from all across the country. So people are coming to Beechwood to do this pilgrimage. There's often tobacco packets placed on his headstone. There's often rocks from all the different treaty territories. What makes his grave so unique is that for the longest time, individuals were leaving letters and messages for him. And so to facilitate that, ensure that we could protect them, we added a mailbox. So Peter Henderson Bryce is one of the only people who passed away in 1932 that has a mailbox. And of course, here's another example of that plaque program that talks about the genocide, the century, the 7 generations of genocide and cultural genocide that was subjected to our Indigenous communities here in Canada. So again, these are examples of the plaque program that we've put in place. And so Peter Henderson Bryce becomes this really forgotten figure in Canadian history. And thankfully, we're seeing lots of new stories come out and lots of video, and we've really reclaimed his history and claimed who he is. And this was a movie that was produced by Defining Moments Canada, and I won't play it all because I am cognizant of the time, but it just definitely shows you how history evolves, and this gentleman really becomes that voice from that period. Um, but I'll just move it up to a wonderful moment in the video. And they were able to look at his documentation
Thanks
that he did.
to new legislation passed in 1884, which Bryce drafted, the board gained the power to directly investigate the causes of diseases and issue regulations to prevent their spread, secure sanitary conditions, and establish stricter quarantines. En 1882, a growing wave of immigrants, a year a été nommé médecin en chef du ministère fédéral de l'Intérieur et des Affaires indiennes. À l'époque, le Canada connaît une vague croissante d'immigration en provenance d'Europe.
So what I'll do is I'll put this in, but the story talks about how this man gives up a lot of his life and risks almost everything to speak on behalf of Indigenous people. Really an inspiring story, and a lot of the children understand his importance in reconciliation. So another one of the figures at Beechwood, which we've dealt with on a regular basis, is Nicolas Flood Davin, and I'll play the video as we talk about them. Nicolas Flood Davin was a Protestant Irish immigrant who was a lawyer and who came to Canada to be a lawyer. He was the MP for the parts of the Assiniboine region of Manitoba. And Nicolas Flood Davin was a journalist, a lawyer, and what he did is he founded a couple newspapers in in the region. And in the early part of the Macdonald government, he was he was tasked by Sir John A. to figure out what to do with the Indigenous problem. Of course, not using those terms at that period. So Nicolas Flood Davin ends up writing the Davin Report, and he's inspired by an American former general called Carlisle and the Carlisle Mechanized School System, or the Carlisle Institute. And what that was, it was a military style Reformation school that saw punishment, malnutrition, and really looked at destroying the child to rebuild him in the image of the school or in the image of the soldier. So this is what Nicholas Flood Davin inspired himself to build to write the Davin Report, which becomes the defining document to create the residential school in Canada. And you can see that his monument itself has been vandalized once or twice with paint, which is something that we wish people would take a moment and take a look at the plaque, telling individuals his legacy within the community. He's an interesting figure on our tours, especially with different people, because you can imagine a lot of the times the school children ask us, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? Because they think in that black and white aspect. And Nicholas Flood Davin, in this case, becomes an interesting figure because, of course, he was a journalist, a politician, founder of the Regina Leader paper, but he is also an advocate for women's suffrage and the status of different provinces. So this makes him a really important figure in Canadian history. But he creates the Davin Report, so the kids really, and most people don't understand where he stands in Canadian history. So again, you can see his monument. It's the wonderful bust, and it's one of the great Canadian artists that actually developed it. W.S. Elward. He dies in Winnipeg of self-inflicted wounds, and he was brought back to Ottawa to be buried in this burial space. We don't actually know what his personal belief was when it comes to residential schools or his personal belief towards Indigenous populations. But based on the Davin Report, we do understand that he believed that a system of residential schools needed to be founded. Again, an interesting person within this tour as well. William McDougall, of course, he's a Canadian politician, father of Confederation, served as Minister of Public Works in the Macdonald government. He gets appointed Lieutenant Governor of Rupert's Land and the Northwest Western Territories in 1969. And this is where his entry into reconciliation, we know that he was anti-Catholic, we know that he was anti-Indigenous, we know that he was described as a vain, erratic, and irredeemable pig-headed man. But what he is known for within the Métis community is he was the person who asked the Crown, who asked the RCMP to enter into the Louis Riel's territory and the Métis territory, and to put down the Métis resistance. And again, at Beechwood, we're looking to uncolonize words, and in this case, we acknowledge and fully understand that it would have been a resistance and not a rebellion, as it had been previously taught in most schools. So he becomes this sort of defining figure and pushes the community, the Métis community, out of Manitoba and really has them settle in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta, where they were no longer able to go back to their traditional territories. The person by excellence, of course, is Olive Patricia Dickason. So she becomes a Métis historian journalist. She becomes a key figure in historical studies in Canada. Her story is one that acknowledges the importance of oral tradition and how having a voice and having an Indigenous voice telling Indigenous stories and writing Indigenous history really changes that mark of Canadian society. And you can see she entered Ottawa U at the age of 50, and she had to fight the colonial mindset of education, that idea that education had to be written down, education had to be really developed by old documents. She pushed to have the oral traditions and the oral histories, which we've all come to know very well, and we all do it within our own families, as a hallmark and a landmark of Canadian history. So you can see the name of her thesis, which she did in the University of Alberta, where she ended up teaching for almost 20 years, including creating the Alberta School, the Alberta and the Aboriginal Studies program of the University of Alberta. But her most significant work, of course, is Canada's First Nation, A History of Founding People. She goes on to teach and then is forced into retirement afterwards. And Olive Patricia Dickason, at that point, as she's forced into retirement, she fights the government yet again and tries to get that overturned, that her ability to teach and keep teaching. However, she loses that fight, comes back to Ottawa because her children are here, and she becomes a guest lecturer at the University of Ottawa, well up until she passes away. So you can definitely see she's the most contemporary person on this tour. But a lot of people, after the affirmation of the Grazing Kamloops, um, learned of her programming and learned from, of all people, Dan Levy from Schitt's Creek about the programming that she developed at the University of Alberta and some of the documents that she produced afterwards. So again, a very important contemporary person. And as we're teaching and as we're working through this programming with school children, we remind them that there is an importance to have a voice and have authentic voices sharing authentic histories. And that's where Olive Patricia Dickason is. And we're really proud to make sure that she's always included in our tours as somebody who took a chance and who had to fight a very traditional education system to then become the mother of Indigenous history in Canada. And she not only raised and taught a generation of historians, but ensured that we can have that connection, that important understanding that we need to include Indigenous voices in everything we do, and especially when we're talking about Canadian history and Confederation history as well. So, as I said, our program really launched in 2015. It was a collaboration between First Nation Caring Society historians and Beechwood itself, as well as Kairos. And over the years, we've tried to add components in different activities. And so we've done blanket exercises, we've done different programming. The blanket exercise being one of the emotionally insightful exercises where, of course, you have the blankets that represent Turtle Island. And as colonialism comes, you get pushed further and further into single small locations, really telling the journey through a series of blankets of our Indigenous populations in Canada. So it becomes this idea that we're going to build on it every point. So we continue to do our education initiatives. We continue to do plaque unveilings. We unveiled over the years the plaque for Duncan Campbell Scott, for Nicolas Flood Davin. We unveiled the plaque for Olive Patricia Dickason. We unveiled a Reconciling History plaque. And then by 2021, as we're looking and as that entry of the rest of the country into Truth and Reconciliation, and really an entry into the transition from Orange Shirt Day to the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, we had a moment of insightful opportunity where a friend of ours from the Project of Heart program loaned us 57,000 tiles made by children to represent Indigenous children who went to residential school. And what we turned this incredible moment into was a memory labyrinth. So across our sacred space, which is a building built to really reflect Indigenous values as well, with beams along with wooden beams apparent in our sacred space that has that is reflective of the Algonquin Longhouse, which is, of course, the Indigenous people from our region. So we did a memory labyrinth where you had every residential school represented from east to west, and people were able to walk and see the impact. So you can imagine that these tiles are no bigger than about a toonie. So to have 57,000 of them laid out in a labyrinth, it was a really powerful moment for a lot of people. And it really cemented people's idea that this is a problem, that this is an issue, this is a concept, that reconciliation as a whole is a journey that we need to take together, and that they need to be active participants, not only in reconciliation activities, but also active participants in listening and understanding what has gone on with reconciliation across Canada and what the legacy of the residential schools, the legacy of the 60s scoop, the legacy of the millennial scoop has really done to the Indigenous communities in Canada. So it was a very powerful display. As I previously mentioned, so this is the first iteration of Peter Henderson Bryce's mailbox, and we did this pretty early on. Again, it's to collect these messages, and the family has allowed us to open the different messages that we receive. And a lot of the time, what we've learned is that people have a guilt of not knowing, and they definitely talk about how they write to Bryce how they wish they were brave like he was, or how they wish that they could have done something more when they were of working age or as youth, just having a commitment to reconciliation. So again, this becomes a very focal point for a lot of our youth programming as well. And as I said just today, we had about 100 kids share their thoughts in letter format to this. And having a child a youth sit down and write a letter of reflection on a program that they just went through is really strong and a really key indicator on how they've been able to understand the messaging that we've provided and our entire Reconciling History program. So the 2013 Truth and Reconciliation activities, we started with a preamble. So on June 10th, 2023, we planted 2 cedars, and of course, cedar being that sacred herb and a very important plant within Indigenous culture. And we placed 94 calls representing the TRC's calls to action. We painted 13 of them orange to show completion. And this is a very good visual reminder that when you're driving through the cemetery at night, you can see this pop of color and understand that there's still a long ways to go. We're always talking about the recommendations. And as a private company, and of course, I should have preambled this, Beechwood is a private company. And it's our duty to live reconciliation and do it in a very meaningful way. And I think we're working on ensuring that that's always a mindset within our work and our programming. So the September 30th, 2023, as part of our Truth and Reconciliation Day, we unveiled a new site, and it's the Children's Sacred Forest. And what makes this an amazing moment is that we had youth from A7G, as well as the former Premier of Northwest Territories, unveil this monument. And this monument really has become a focal point, not only for children, but from people coast to coast to coast, that they see it as a moment of reflection and remembrance. And I'll play the little video that we did, and you can see that it's written in Algonquin, English, and French. And what makes this, we really thought about how can we make sure that this is a symbol and a place that of reflection, but also that connects. So there are 3 stones, and of course, in Indigenous culture, the 3 stone, any boulder or rock or stone is considered our grandmother teaching us, our grandfather teaching us history, sharing history. And so we planted 3 stones, 3 being a sacred number across cultures. If you're Christian, it's the Holy Trinity. Geometry, it's the perfect number. 3 is considered a lucky number in a lot of different cultures. But behind that, we have 7 dwarf small trees that will never grow bigger than that. And of course, we're looking at the 7 generations, 7 being an important number in most society, as well as the 7 sacred teachings or the 7 grandfathers that we see across First Nations culture. And it creates a very visually stunning moment. So people have been coming and laying stones at the base, which was the intent. But again, when we unveiled it, it was this poignant moment for everyone to understand the importance of having a place of reflection and honoring the children that never were able to come back. And that could be come back to their communities or even the children who passed away. So as part of the program itself, we were lucky enough to have a book that Dr. Blackstock wrote a book about us, and this is really that story of Spirit Bear, which is, of course, the First Nations Caring Society's mascot, and Echo, which is that little fox blowing bubbles. And it's a story about Spirit Bear coming to Beechwood and learning about our programming and how reconciliation will work, how we can look at telling more, how every time we remove a statue of McDonald, we're also removing his the negative legacy that he had, but we're also not telling the truth about that legacy. We're almost erasing that memory. So what we've always advocated and what the program looks to do is to provide more context and more information and more education so that people really understand. We often get, I'll often get phone calls when people are removing statues like this. And my belief is that you need to depedestal them. You need to put them at um, almost at ground level so people can confront them properly. But you also need to explain the history in a meaningful way. But you have to do that with the First Nations and the people that are surrounding community, so that it's not a unilateral decision, but it's a decision made as an act of reconciliation instead of making something disappear, but working together instead to build something bigger. So our ongoing commitment, and this is where Beechwood, again, being a private business, it's quite interesting that we're pursuing this. So every year we actually close down on September 30th our operations, so our burial and our cemetery operations, and we have a full day of education. And this year we're focusing, because it's on a Monday, of bringing schools in, playing the video, and having them experience this very similar tour. But every day this month, I've got people from Health Canada to a university to a teacher scholars coming to experience the same tour that you guys are doing via Zoom. So again, when we're looking at future editions, how can we enable this program? How can we build this program up even more? And so as we're searching our history and searching our ideas, we look at people like Sir Lyman Port Duff, who was a Supreme Court justice. But what made him so interesting in 1944, he was advocating for the establishment of an Indigenous court system, understanding that the colonial court system itself, or the court system of a Eurocentric legal framework, really did not work for the Indigenous populations of Canada. So this initiative really sought to understand the cultural and community sensitivities, but also provide a judicial system and process for the Indigenous community by the Indigenous community. So from a really a Eurocentric mindset of a person like Duff, he was able to lay the groundwork for that nation-to-nation relationship that we're hopefully striving to at one point. Again, we're always careful on who to add. So this may not be somebody that we do on every tour with our Reconciling History, but when we're looking at government departments, when we're looking at um, teaching colleges and different colleges, it's a great opportunity to show how you can have people in 1944 really promoting that nation and nation building, or understanding that there needs to be more done for the Indigenous community when it comes to legal rights as well. We all know that there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, and that's because the colonial justice system itself is built as a punishment system, as opposed to this process would have been quite different. And again, Diamond Jeunesse is another example. He makes He's an anthropologist from New Zealand who comes to Canada as part of the Great Arctic Pursuit, and he's best known for his work with the Inuit up north, where he not only documented their language, their custom, their traditional way of life, but he becomes an advocate. He comes back down to southern Canada and becomes an advocate for the recognition of not only Inuit people but all Indigenous cultures across the country. So he takes his understanding and develops not only information, but an advocacy way to ensure that we can protect the traditional cultures and traditional ways of life of the Indigenous community. And he's one that whenever we know that we have people from Inuit people coming to Beechwood, we'll try to make sure to include him in the tour as well. Sadly, he's at the other end of our cemetery, and when you come to Beechwood, you'll notice that we're 160 acres, so it does take quite a while. Military reconciliation is another part of this program. It's not part of our traditional Reconciling History program. It's become its own entity. And so at the National Military Cemetery, and you can see how large Beechwood is in this case, this is only a small fraction of us. But on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the National Military Cemetery of the Canadian Forces. So anything from NATO forward. And that's the section that we'll jump into right now to talk about how we've adapted our Reconciling History program and how we have worked towards reconciliation within an institution like the Canadian military. And so in 2021, we had a soldier died from moral injuries. Again, that was it's how the military identifies suicide now. And we realized that there was this soldier had gone through a journey of self discovery and really embracing his Indigenous heritage, which he didn't know before he passed away. And in 2021, we were able to do an entire program where we went through the military to get two sacred symbols, and they're not religious symbols; they're symbols of cultural and spiritual identity. So you can see the medicine wheel and the Métis infinity symbol or the Métis belt. And what we did is we went through a parallel process of both working with civilians and working with military to identify what symbols should be are culturally significant. And this is General Paul in the center talking to the daughter of the first corporal to receive the First Nation symbol of the medicine wheel. And General Paul is was the highest ranking Indigenous member in the Canadian military, being commander of the Ground Forces of Canada. So we had this really wonderful moment, and our local elder Peter Del Conte also provided that initial blessing to the stones. And so this becomes really a symbol of moving forward. And you can see that we've got the First Nation symbol and the Métis symbol, but we've been working with the Inuit community to develop a kulik, which is of course that traditional oil lamp that the people from the north use all across. So we've been working on a slow process, a little different process with that community, but we definitely want to make sure that people are included and really are able to highlight who they are and what they've accomplished in life as well as in death. So you can see Corporal Cannell's grave behind us. And again, honoring Indigenous veterans is really important. We know that prior to having these symbols, a lot of the veterans' graves the community would go out and write Huron warrior on them or write Indigenous warrior on the graves. But this is a moment, the first time in 500 years since first contact, that a traditional grave in this sense has this information. And you can see on Corporal Cannell, you see his name, but he was given of a spirit name posthumously, and that was another project that we had to sort of address within the military. It's very prescribed, as you can imagine, within the military of what should be allowed on a headstone. But he was given this name, and we went through the process where we proved, just like in the judicial system, that the word of an elder is as equal as any other legal document. And for the first time ever, and moving forward, Indigenous peoples can have Indigenous names, their spirit names on monuments. And this is a defining moment in reconciliation in Canada, in my opinion as well. And then you can see the Métis symbol as well. So again, the broader implications, it allows Indigenous symbols on military gravestone. It reflects that broader movement towards reconciliation. It's a model that other institutions can follow, and we often sort of challenge other institutions to follow suit by acknowledging and incorporating Indigenous practices and practice of truth and reconciliation into into their own day-to-day activities. So again, I'm not saying that Beechwood is a leader in this space, but what I am saying is that we've taken the time and we're continuing to walk in a moment of reflection and a moment of reconciliation. We keep moving forward, and we're hoping that we believe we're in the right direction. The elders that we speak to and the community that we work with are all sort of helping us lead the way into that direction. And the idea is to really look at how can we foster that understanding between all Canadians so that we have the mindset of reconciliation being a daily activity. How can a private company embody that? How can me as an individual embody that as well? So this is the journey that we've been on, and it's a long journey of 10 years. I'll leave with a wonderful anecdote. And Senator Sinclair, or sorry, Judge Commissioner, retired Senator Sinclair, the man has so many accolades. It's hard to know exactly what title to give him, but Commissioner of the TRC, Murray Sinclair, actually publicly stated that the one place he believes that reconciliation is done well happens to be in his backyard and happens to be a cemetery. And to us, this was a moment of reflection and a moment of honor to have such a leader and such a committed leader publicly acknowledge our role. And then we've also since then had all the Truth and Reconciliation commissioners come out to Beechwood and take the tours and give us insights and information about how to do it. And it's all been met very, very positively. So you can imagine over the course of the next few weeks, Beechwood becomes this place covered in orange shirts with people ready to learn, ready to understand, and really ready to sort of take that first step into the journey of reconciliation, but most important, starting with the idea of understanding the truth that we've been told. So we get confronted quite often as well about how we're rewriting history or how we're changing Canadian history, and how we always answer the question is history is ever moving, and we need to ensure that the voices of Indigenous people are put in an equal position as all the other voices, and that we cannot have a fulsome national cemetery of Canada without having those voices. And this brings me to exactly my time 143, which is ideal. So I think we'll open it up to some questions. And I'm going to stop sharing so maybe I can see some people as well who want to share some information. So are there any questions? But again, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. And as we await some questions, I'm happy to. Um, no, I'm not Indigenous, so I'm Irish French. A long legacy in Canada on the French side, very recent immigrant on the Canadian side. Um, but I'm very sensitive and ensuring that people do understand that. If I misrepresented myself at any point at the beginning, I do apologize. Was not intentional, but we get to sort of share a lot of information this way. So thank you, Rob. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, again, there could be any kind of question that is possible. The Reconciling History program in the military. Have I ever been to BC? Yes, I've been to BC. Victoria is beautiful. The cultures around Victoria are unbelievable as well. Again, our program, we are national, but the information that we go get and the connections we have are with the Anishinaabe, Algonquin people from our region, right? And even when we're looking at introducing Indigenous symbolism across in the military section, we do go to the elders of our local Algonquin community and ask them, when did the first residential school open and the last one close? Um, when it opened, I don't really recall. The last federal run to close is 1996, and the last provincial one was 1998. And if you speak to Inuit, they'll very much talk about how they're often forgotten because they're so far away. And 1998 represents a key moment for them with the last item. So, what do I find most interesting about? I don't think I necessarily find something interesting. What I find heartbreaking is that um, while growing up, there was a secondary school system that was in my country. The same time I was going to French Catholic school, we had Indigenous people being removed from their families on a regular basis and being forced to go to schools in languages that they did not know, in places that they were not connected to, and forced to do that. And then I look at my children. who are 10 and turning 13 at the end of next month. And I look how they're the first generation to ever be raised without that racist system. But we know for a fact that Indigenous people are already, there's the millennial scoop of being removed from their families as well by social services. There's the 60 scoop, which was the exact same thing. And when you hear the stories of these individuals, I know one gentleman whose mother crossed the street to get milk because she ran out of milk, and they were, by the time she got back, they were taken away from their family. And I think this is the legacy that we need to speak out about, and this is a legacy that we need to take a moment and reflect on how this entire population of people, these beautiful cultures, 600 different First Nations group representing 2,000 different locations across the country, how beautiful culture, and how could we sort of have a system in Canada that removed their rights and removed their culture from their languages, their connection to their own community. And I think that's something to always reflect. I'm and so I'm my heart warms to know that there are people out there who are looking to reclaim their culture, reclaim their spirituality, reclaim their symbolism, reclaim their dances, reclaim their traditions, and how we're seeing am sharing it outward as well and teaching others, and not only teaching Indigenous people, but teaching non-Indigenous Canadians as well. So it's very heartwarming to see that movement in that direction in our country. So yeah, thank you. Any other questions? So we've got a few moments left. Is there something that individuals can do which is Oh, that's a really, really good question. So the question is there something that individuals can do which is similar to what your cemetery has done? I think the first thing we should all be looking at is how can we decolonize our language? And that's something that I often speak about here at the cemetery, right? So growing up, just the prime example, we talked about Métis, the rebellion of Louis Riel. Well, now we should be calling it a Métis resistance because you had a foreign power coming into traditional territories and telling people how they are, right, and what to do. And even something as simple as oftentimes you'll hear people speak about the graves, the discovery of graves, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had talk about the graves beside residential schools. It had talked about that there are these cemeteries all across the country. So even from that perspective, I think it's not that we shouldn't be using the word discovery because our indigenous populations, indigenous peoples have always told us. So oftentimes I find myself using the term we affirmed or reaffirmed the graves that were already existing. In Ontario, there was a large, so Juniper asks, so were there any residential schools near me, near here in Ottawa, and all across the region of the Ottawa-Gatineau, so Ottawa and Quebec, there was residential schools. So to know that there was this dual system within the 100 kilometers from where I am growing up while I was going to school is atrocious. And knowing that these kids couldn't go to school, couldn't go home either, or if their mothers or fathers or grandparents wrote letters to the school asking the kids to come home, they wouldn't be allowed to come home at Christmas or even sometimes it's summer, but they weren't coming home to a community that they were accustomed to anymore because we had removed their history and their culture and their cultural identity. So again, thank you for the question. So on what other things people can do, I think it's be curious. There's a wonderful book, 21 Things to Know About the Indian Act by Bob Thomas, and he does a series of two books, and it talks about what we can do as individuals and really breaks it down so that you have an understanding of what the act is, but also an understanding of how to engage. I think people often can be afraid to ask questions or afraid to offend somebody, but if you're doing it in a very open manner, no one will ever be offended by you asking a question, have a better understanding of a tradition or an action or a ceremony that someone is doing. So I think be curious, but be respectful. Again, never touch anybody's possessions or anybody's regalia or anybody's instruments without being told to do so. That's another, and understanding that one tradition for one community may not be the same for another. Oftentimes, people, this is a good example that one of the books I recently read talked about, and how if you're of Scottish descent, you wouldn't want to be called, wouldn't want everyone to call you British, right, or European, because your cultural baggage, your identity is built in Scotland. So it's the same thing. As you can imagine, 600 bands across Canada with 2,000 different locations. So it's a very diverse community, very diverse people. And from one community to another, even within the same geographic area, it could be very different. So again, the idea is to be open heart, and the concept of respect as well is there. And again, Bob Thomas has a great part of his book about respect, and how you want to be respectful of the identity. You want to establish a relationship. You want to secure yourself as your knowledge and have an understanding. So again, there's a few really good readings that people could do that are accessible and easy to read. Any other questions? Again, this is a topic that is very important in Canadian history, and it was neglected for a long time, a long period. All right, so if that's the case, again, I'd like to thank you guys for your time. I'd like to thank everyone for taking 45 minutes to an hour with me today. And again, these discussions are very important. And if anybody from the Zoom comes to Ottawa, let me know. What happens to statues that are removed? So it all depends on, so one last question then, statues that are removed. So the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald that was removed from Kingston has been put at his grave at Cataraqui Cemetery, and they're looking to add some context to that as well. But oh, there's a few in the Q&A. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed some Q&As in the Q&A box. Again, so with the statues that are removed, a lot of them get removed and placed into museums, which makes sense as well. What are the cultural and historical aspects of Indigenous communities that you think people should think more people should understand or appreciate? Oh, that's a really good question. Again, I don't consider myself an expert on that, but I think it's to be open and learn about it and go realize what band, what tribe, what community is in your where you live, and understanding what their identity is and how you can embrace, how you can take a look at what they're doing and have an understanding and learn, and what impacted them, what history affected them, where in Canadian history did residential schools were imposed? Was the RCMP ever used to push them out of traditional lands? What are their concerns? The easiest thing you could do is even just use Google Alerts, and you set yourself a few Google Alerts of the local communities you live near, and just have a better understanding of what they're undertaking. So I think that's a really easy way to start the conversation. But again, you take a look at all these different traditions, and from the jingle dance here in Ontario, Ottawa, my region, which is an unbelievable act of resilience and an unbelievable thing that has passed down through 7 generations. Or there's so many things that you, from throat singing to sort of the beadwork. It all really depends. I was lucky enough, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, to be with a large group of people who are being honored for reconciliation, and just the conversations that we had were unbelievable. Um, and they're inspiring that the future is going to be safe. How can we meaningfully acknowledge, integrate histories, culture, and perspectives of Indigenous people into Canada, into our understanding of identity and reconciliation, while addressing the impacts of that? Is a question all itself. I think the first part of it is learning, right? Read and have an understanding, and look for not only Indigenous histories, but Indigenous novels, Indigenous fiction. Take a look at musicians that are performing. See if there's any local um, local public events, and you attend those and you start to learn about the culture. Um, there's um, there's a lot that we can do individually, but there's a lot that we can do as a community, and it's ensuring that we can advocate for safe drinking water, that we can advocate for proper funding, that we can advocate to really build that nation to nation relationship. And I'm hoping that as we're moving forward with reconciliation, that we start seeing, I keep referring to nation because it is the Canadian government and the nation of um, whichever group across whichever Indigenous community across. So we want across Canada. So we want to see the country change in that way. So it makes for a very wholesome part. But again, that is a question that I think we will be addressing for 7 generations, very much so that we will, what can we do and how do we move forward as a country, and how do we move forward to ensure that Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadian are on the same road together. I think the end of for the 150th of Confederation, there's a movie called C3 that came out, and it was people exploring Canada. And I think the end of it still sticks to me. And whenever we talk about reconciliation and moving forward, it's we may not all be in the same boat together, journeying, but as long as we're on the same river, going the same direction, I think we'll be okay. And I'll leave it at that as sort of my final thought, if you guys permit me, is reconciliation is that process, and we may not all be on the same boat at the same time. We may not be at the same area, but you can imagine as long as we're all going the same direction, we're pretty much safe. We're pretty much moving that forward momentum. So again, another great piece to watch. Again, C3 from the 150th. So I'll finish with my thank yous. I appreciate everyone's time. I know how much time is valuable and how many people came out. So I'd like to thank you all for your questions and your attention. And I hope to see you in Ottawa to do this tour with you guys in person and really have those deep conversations. And hope that you leave today with a little more understanding of how reconciliation can be embraced, but also how we can talk about different reconciliation in a meaningful way and how we must find a way to move forward. So again, thank you so much.